recognise there's a skills shortage in the UK, as you'd expect with a new sport, right? So there's just not enough people around, given the growth rate, who know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that's most acute in coaches.
Today we have Rupert Taylor from Smash Padel.
You know, a big part of helping startups and scale-ups is figuring out what is this business actually trying to do?
Yeah.
What's different? How do we tell that story? How do we raise money? We're very, very clear on our premises model.
Yeah.
So what works for us is we were really, really thrilled and honoured to win an LTA Club of the Year award. It's a county-based award, but what was really satisfying is that obviously the LTA being the governing body of tennis, those awards have always gone to tennis operators, and so this is the first time a paddle operator has been recognised in that way. That's kind of the next frontier for us is, and we're already beginning to see the fruits of this, is we're working really hard to develop internally. So I've talked a lot about coaches, but our juniors program feeds our activators, and our activators then feeds our coaches, right?
And that's got to be you want to have that full cycle, right?
Good people are critical to taking people on their paddle journey.
100%.
A huge part of that is good coaches.
Yeah.
But I think we take that a little further and say that good coaching is about much more than good coaching.
Welcome to the Padel Directory Podcast. I'm Toby Bawden and I'll be your interviewer for the TPD Podcast. We're going to have guests on from all walks of life within the paddle space, whether that be high-class coaches, national governing bodies or general influencers, as we all look to navigate this amazing sport in the UK. We can't wait for you to tune in. Welcome back, viewers and listeners. So super excited to host another episode of the TPD, the Padel Directory Podcast. And today we have Rupert Taylor from Smash Padel. Rupert, thanks so much for coming on. It's great. We're over in Bristol for the FIP Silver, so watching some excellent paddle. But thanks so much for taking time out of your day to talk to us about yourself, your journey in paddle, and what you're up to.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me. I didn't know there was an event here today, which perhaps illustrates the extent to which that perhaps I'm not totally a paddle guy, maybe a business guy who's stumbled into paddle, but massively enthusiastic about paddle nonetheless. So thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure. As I said, really excited to delve into how you got into the sport and why you got into sport, and like as you mentioned, from a business background and really kind of the journey that you're on. And obviously we're all super excited about the path that paddle is on in the UK, and we want to see how kind of Smash Padel are navigating it, because there's some super exciting topics we're covering today, particularly around junior program development and also the teams involved in your organisation. So you mentioned you're not really from paddle. How did you come into the sport?
Yeah, so I think personally it's debatable whether or not I'm in paddle. I'm definitely the worst paddle player you would have ever had on the podcast, and I know this is only one of your early episodes, so I suspect I'll continue to hold that title for quite a few months.
That could make for quite an interesting series review at the end, a little tournament.
It's a bit like that Clarkson, star in an average car doing a bad lap. I reckon I'll continue to be beaten by all your guests.
Let's do that. I think at the end of this series, back here, tournament.
Exactly. Slug it out. So I was invited by a former colleague and friend to answer a business question for him, which was he wanted to know where in the UK was a good place to site paddle businesses, and so I helped build a software engine which triangulated disposable income and propensity to play racket sports.
Okay, wow.
Which was a score based on prevalence of tennis, squash, badminton facilities in the area.
Understood, yeah.
So we built this machine that goes to postcode level and gives a score for every postcode in the country for, is this a good place to put a paddle business? And it was a fun project, and as part of that project I got a sense of how underpenetrated paddle was in the UK, and my at that stage limited understanding of the UK planning environment
of course
told me that that was going to be a very long penetration journey, and that felt like an interesting climate for a business. So that was my starting point. I blame my 2 and 4 year old children and the fact I have no paddle courts in my town for why I remain quite so terrible at paddle. But yeah, I very much came at this because I thought it was a really interesting business prospect, and the kind of paddle and coaching and participation stuff I've learned and embraced along the way.
No, it's super interesting. So the piece that you did of that software, was that commissioned by a paddle company to do, or?
Yeah, sorry. So that was commissioned by Smash Padel.
Okay, amazing. Yeah.
And so I then thought, this is interesting. Please, can I be your finance director? And then, the way the wheels turn mysteriously, I've ended up being the chief exec. So I think I've been involved in the business for getting on for 3 years. Kind of became finance director 2.5 years ago, and then became chief exec last March.
Okay, amazing. Yeah, I was going to ask, what's your your timeline and journey? So you've actually been with Smash for quite some time now, and now obviously the roles have developed. That's really interesting. And your professional background prior to that is in finance, or? Yeah,
so I did 14 years in finance, and then 10 odd years building and scaling various businesses, but more in media, financial data, renewable energy. So all really interesting businesses. But again, nothing on the sports front.
So quite separate maybe from sports, but presumably you're able to turn your hand, and the business acumen that you have has lent itself to Smash Padel and how you've tried to set up that business. Have you brought a lot of kind of experience from that side? Because
I hope so. I mean, I was consulting for startups and scale-ups when I took that little job for Smash, building the software engine. And a big part of helping startups and scale-ups is figuring out what is this business actually trying to do?
Yeah.
What's different? How do we tell that story? How do we raise money?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's those journeys, isn't it? And it's that trial and error process.
So that was kind of the skill set that I'd established, I suppose. And I feel actually really fortunate that I stumbled into this space where I could apply those skills in a really interesting, exciting market.
And it is pretty exciting.
Yeah,
and fast moving and ever changing. So that's super interesting. So in terms of Smash now, if you want to tell kind of the viewers and listeners a little bit about the business, how many sites you have, how many courts at each site, and just a general flavour of where you guys are, and maybe a little bit on what your plans are going forward as well.
Sure. So we have 3 sites: Bicester, Oxford, and Whitstable. We open Mid Sussex in about 2 weeks, certainly this month.
Oh, great.
And then we open Cardiff in June. So that'll be 5. We're very, very clear on our premises model.
Yeah.
So what works for us is we find an outdoor site, and then we put ourselves through the pain and misery of the planning system to get planning permission to weather protect the site with canopies.
Yeah.
And that's really, really central to what we do, because we differentiate ourselves by heavily staffing our sites.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting.
And to us, that works best where we've created some value by finding an outdoor site, i.e. paying a relatively sensible rent. Mm-hmm. Then that allows us the headroom to really go for it on staff and people.
Okay, amazing. And the sites you've mentioned, how many courts are they? And maybe some of the newer sites that are opening, will they be similar number?
Yeah, so Bicester is 5, 3 covered, 2 uncovered. Oxford is 3, all uncovered, but very hopeful. We're imminently about to get planning.
I was going to say planning.
Canopies on top.
yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah, I think it's just a technicality that we haven't got permission there yet, but it seems to have been signed off. Whitstable, 3 courts all covered. Mid Sussex, 3 courts covered. Cardiff, 6 courts covered.
Brilliant.
And actually, with it, Bicester we started with 3, and we've grown it to 5 and added the covers. Ideally, they're 5 or 6 court sites with covers.
Okay, and the number that you've touched on there, 5 or 6, is there a reason behind that number from a lot of your sort of data and things that you've looked at? Is that?
Yeah, so because staff is so important to us, it's easier to cover that staff commitment with a slightly bigger site. And we also think there's a bit of a sweet spot in terms of organising effective tournaments, hosting school classes, hosting SMEs. Particularly with schools, it's an easy way to think about it. If you can't get all the kids on court,
it's quite tricky.
It's a bit frustrating, right? Exactly. You'll know as a coach.
Yeah.
So that's our sweet spot.
Okay, perfect. And in terms of, you've mentioned it a few times and referenced kind of your staffing and how important people are. Can you talk about that and kind of how each site, how is that kind of manned in terms of staff?
Yeah, so, we recognise there's a skills shortage in the UK, as you'd expect with a new sport, right? So there's just not enough people around, given the growth rate, who know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that's most acute in coaches. And we've been very fortunate to find some really good coaches. But that's probably partly because we really went for it. So, we put all our coaches on a full-time employment contract.
Okay.
And we invest aggressively in their future. So, we put them on all the LTA pathways in terms of, coach development, qualifications, also CPD.
Yeah.
And then we supplement that with our own coach education programs, bringing in skills from abroad, going on trips, everything we can to really push.
I think that's brilliant, right? I think, there are great courses out there, but you are also spending time outside of those to invest in your staff and upskill them. And do you also find now having like multi-sites, are you sharing lots of ideas and best practices? I mean, that's got to be key, right, as well?
Yeah, massively. So probably as you can, figure from the preamble, none of this is from me, right? So I'm merely kind of, bringing together an amazingly skilled team who have got the experience in sport, to make all this happen. But the way we think about it is that good people are critical to taking people on their paddle journey.
100%.
A huge part of that is good coaches.
Yeah.
But I think we take that a little further and say that good coaching is about much more than good coaches. And, every coach is going to have strengths and weaknesses. But what is hard generally for a coach is a lot of the off-court stuff.
Yeah.
So programming, scheduling, that is not necessarily going to come as naturally.
It's not for everyone, is it? You're going to have some coaches that just love being on court and only want to be on court, and you have other coaches that actually do want to learn a bit more about it. But if you can kind of blend the two, it's super important, especially in paddle.
And I think the way you try and blend it is, you hire the best coaches you can, and then you provide that support to make them able to be even better, right? So if they're not so good at scheduling and programming, you put in place the infrastructure to kind of help them learn and pick all that up.
Just like being on a paddle court, you've got to work on strengths and weaknesses
for
the players. You've got to work on the strengths and weaknesses of your teams and your coaches. And I think it's so inspiring, certainly from the outside looking in at your business, at how much time and effort you are spending with the teams. And it's critical. I'm a massive believer that the first time that person comes in to your paddle venue, first 5-10 minutes are make or break. So all of your staff singing off the same hymn sheet sounds great.
Yeah, and actually it's worth saying, that's not just about coaching.
Absolutely.
Right? So we're very conscious that, paddle's easy to pick up, and most people who come off paddle court have fun. And they would do it again if the opportunity presented itself. But that's not the same as them being certain this is their new sport and being properly hooked and making a commitment every Tuesday at 6 o'clock from here till next winter, right? And achieving that transition is about good coaching. It's about excellent front of house staff. It's about having the right programming to offer them, so that you capture that enthusiasm when they come off the court for the first time and turn it into a kind of lifelong habit.
Definitely. I was talking sort of about programming. Especially with maybe new sites opening up, how do you kind of set about that first sort of stage of programming, and what are you trying to do to encourage new players into the sport and capture that enthusiasm?
Yeah, so we subsidise the early stages.
Okay.
Right. So Intro to Paddle is always free, and then we try and encourage anyone who's had fun to sign up to a beginner's paddle program.
Yeah.
Which for us is 8 sessions, and that's heavily subsidised. And then we have a very clear pathway beyond that, where they can then get involved with socials for other people who have graduated from that same program, but also all the other various learning opportunities, match play with a coach, private coaching, group coaching, other socials,
So there's a very clear pathway from that person walking in off the street, and if that person has played lots of paddle, they can also jump in at various stages.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
great.
Exactly.
It's very comprehensive, and we'll touch on it more later in the show, but you've heavily invested in the juniors. It's key. I'm a very strong believer it's key for the future of the sport, but what's been the reason for you as a business to do that? What's the kind of the main driving force? Because it's everywhere I kind of look at, you are being talked about as the business within the UK that's doing the most for juniors. So I'd love to touch on that.
Yeah, so obviously there's a strong participation angle, but what's really satisfying about this is that it seemed to us to be a clear business case, right? Because we heavily subsidise our junior program, but it's also been a huge help in us meeting landlords who want the right kind of paddle operation at their location. And I think, if you look across the sports world, there's a lot of landlords out there who get the importance of a strong junior section and participation. And so, we're more than happy to make that investment. And, it's kind of been in hindsight, and again, this is none of my wisdom, it's been an inevitable consequence of the investment we made in coaching, because, if you really take that coaching piece seriously and want to invest in the future, then you're going to attract the kind of coach who wants the excitement and challenge of taking a young person and putting them on that journey to potentially the top, right?
And that's what's so kind of, I touched on it in one of the previous episodes, it's so exciting that you have got people finding the sport at any age, but talking about kind of 12, 13, 14, they're now getting to compete abroad, compete internationally, events here at the weekend. We've got top players all over the world coming into Bristol to play. It's so exciting, and for a coach, like you say, you want to have that pathway, right? And take one of these players on that journey. So that's great, and you've really, I think, captured, certainly when I'm looking outside in, lots of different kind of sessions for different levels of juniors, which I think is really, really impressive to see, because I think there is a little bit in the UK where people just throw in a session and say, we've got a junior paddle program. Well, have you got all of the ages and stages covered? Are you thinking about which equipment to be using in each of those sessions? It breaks my heart when I see little 5 and 6 year olds running around with adult rackets, for example. You've got to think very carefully about the program. So that's good to hear. Yeah,
so we segment it both by age and to some extent by ability.
Yeah.
Because there comes a point where it makes sense to have a kind of performance program and a regular program.
No, it's great. So that's been super interesting so far. We're going to take a little break now, and we're going to touch more on your junior programs and some of the future sites you're going to be building. Thanks so much.
The Paddle Directory is for anyone that wants to find out more about paddle in the UK. It's a space for coaches, players, businesses, and anyone that wants to pick up a racket for the first time. Check out the website below.
So, welcome back to the second half of the TPD podcast. Rupert, super interesting discussion, and off air we were having some, we didn't stop talking actually about paddle in the UK and all the goings on, and it's obviously, as we know, a fantastic space to be working in, and I can sense how passionate you are about the sport, even though you've not necessarily come from it, which is really interesting. Actually, I'm interested, any other sports have you kind of...
So, generally I'm not great at sport, but the only other insights I can offer is that in a previous life I spent a lot of time skiing, and so I did see up close skiing's response to the emergence of snowboarding. And then more recently, I also observed windsurfing's response to the emergence of kitesurfing. And there's definitely some similarities in that in both of those cases the incumbent sport felt threatened, initially tried to sort of squash it and dismiss it and hope it wasn't going to happen, and then eventually it seems there's kind of an acceptance it is happening. And I think we might come on to talk about the LTA. I think full credit to the LTA, because the only approach is to embrace it, because it is coming, and that all you can do is extract the benefits, right? And there will be benefits, because the revolution in skiing technology was a reaction to snowboarding, right? Skis used to be straight until snowboarding arrived, right?
And the carvers came out, and
it's all changed. In windsurfing, all the jumps have changed, and the jumps are much more interesting now because they had to respond to this easier sport, which they were rude about, but actually it taught them how to jump differently, right? So you have to embrace it, and I think it's to the LTA's credit that they've got on top of it in the UK, and I think are doing some amazing things.
I think that's, and I think it takes time, right? It takes time to evaluate and look at the differences and learnings from each sport, but it certainly feels that way, that there's so much good happening now and good publicity, which is great to see. But you touched on the LTA. I'm going to touch on that very quickly. I hear that you won some pretty big awards. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I think the context of this is I did approach this podcast wondering if there'd been some mistake and you'd booked us by accident, because we're not a very big paddle operator. We have big ambitions, but 3 sites moving to 5. But yeah, we were really, really thrilled and honoured to win an LTA Club of the Year award. It's a county-based award, but what was really satisfying is that obviously the LTA being the governing body of tennis, those awards have always gone to tennis operators, and so this is the first time a paddle operator has been recognised in that way. And actually, on top of that Club of the Year award, there are then excellence awards. So a subset of those clubs of the year get put forward for an excellence award, which we've all also been flattered by, and the recognition relates specifically to what we've done on participation, coaching, and juniors.
It's fantastic. Congratulations, because that's a pretty big thing to be the first paddle club to win an award like that outright. So I think that's amazing testament to yourselves, your teams, your coaches, and the ethos that you're creating. And I think that's what I'm really getting a sense of, is how kind of team-based orientated you are. It's not like you've got lots of kind of self-employed coaches coming in, doing a few hours and then chipping off. Like, you're all in it together. And I've certainly seen firsthand of doing some coach education down in Kent, and a lot of your coaches coming along, and they all come and they're all branded up, and it feels like a real community club, and I'm guessing that's what you're kind of really hoping for.
Yeah, and as I said, this is all new to me, right? I've been on this journey too. I've had to learn, right? And I thought that coaching was just about good coaches, right? And I didn't understand that you have to create the culture around it, you have to create the infrastructure to support it, and there's so much more than just the on-court stuff, right? So we're really working on the off-court stuff, we're really working on the coach education, we're really keen to embrace other cultures. So we have coaches come over from Spain to visit us, we send our coaches over to Spain. Even I managed to justify a trip to Barcelona to go and see what paddle looks like in a mature market.
But that's so key to the whole kind of ecosystem of paddle, which is like, we need to all look at other people and learn from other people, right? Whether it be coaching, whether it be club development, equipment. It's really important to look at other markets, but also know that the UK is, we touched on earlier, planning being quite an interesting beast. But it's, on the participation side, it's really important. We've only been going in the UK not that long, so getting coaches exposed to other programs means that they can just pick off best practice and also improve potentially as well.
Yeah.
So it's great. It's great to hear that you're investing so much for your teams.
Yeah, no, and it's understandable that this is a challenge for the industry, right? It's brand new, and the capacity just can't respond to the demand, right? So, that's the challenge is coach creation, and so we're, that's kind of the next frontier for us, is and we're already beginning to see the fruits of this, is, you know, we're working really hard to develop internally. So I've talked a lot about coaches, but our juniors program feeds our activators, and our activators then feeds our coaches, right?
And that's got to be you want to have that full cycle, right? Of the players coming through the development program or performance, whether it may be, into then activators, into then coaches, and that's so refreshing and exciting to hear. Certainly for someone that's been based in coaching for so long, now to see paddle operators, you know, thinking this way, because it does feel that a lot maybe find the coaching piece challenging, and as a result they don't invest enough in it. So kudos to you guys. It's exciting.
Yeah, and we've been really lucky, you know, because we've found some really interesting people who potentially are from a slightly less conventional background. So we really strongly believe in evidence-led coaching, and you know, we've been blown away by some of the enthusiasm behind that, and actually some of the data we've now been able to collect. So
sorry to interject, when you talk about sort of evidence-based coaching, what do you sort of mean? To maybe explain to the viewers and listeners exactly, if we delve into that a bit closer.
So my favourite illustration is one of our team came back from a futures event in Belgium or the Netherlands, and challenged an industry figure. Not challenge is not the right tone. Ask an industry figure what proportion of returns of serve he would have thought would have been lobs at that level.
Okay.
Maybe I'm not.
I know. I'm feeling like, oh my gosh, you're going to put me on the spot.
So this
here.
is like, I think it was like under 14s or maybe under 16s
okay.
boys. What proportion of returns of serves would be lobs?
Wow, that's actually quite. You're putting me on the spot here. I would say 60%.
Wow. So the industry figure who is a very good friend of ours, and we have huge respect for, his number was 50%.
Okay.
And our number was 15%. Yeah. And the logic was basically that already at that level, you know, their overheads are so good
that they are just keeping it low.
Yeah. And so if you're returning serve and lobbing, it's coming back with interest. Yeah. And it's kind of that kind of approach where, particularly if we're going to take, you know, young British paddle players to this, you know, mature world where they're playing against young people who've grown up with paddle, we feel like we've got to arm them with something to give them half a chance.
Yeah,
right?
it's so true, and it's taking that, isn't it, and taking that evidence as you're touching on, and actually, you know, I'm going to hang my head in shame that I didn't know the answer, but you know, I think it's super important. We don't see it enough in the UK, and the levels here compared to some of the more advanced nations, you know, are quite different. So we have to kind of maybe reset thinking and approach on it. So that's actually, I've learned something today. Thanks.
Yeah, well, you and me both. Don't you worry, I wouldn't have got it either. But yeah, and I think in the UK context, it's just so exciting, isn't it? In terms of just getting young people active. Yeah. Right? It's clearly a massive priority for the country for so many reasons. And you know, paddle, it is inclusive, right? By its nature, it's easy to pick up. You don't spend all day collecting balls, so it has all the characteristics to be an inclusive sport. But I think, you know, the next few years are about the sport in the UK stepping up to fill in the gaps, right? Because it is by its nature inclusive doesn't mean you're delivering something inclusive.
Well,
right?
that's it's something that we touch on quite a lot, which is it's inclusive to play. Also, there are some barriers, right? So it's super refreshing as well to hear that you are subsidising certain things, because it's not the cheapest of sports. Where do you think the sport is going to end up going? Do you think, you know, eventually, obviously we're a long way off saturation point, we know that, but do you think at times maybe the prices will come down overall, or, you know, someone that's from a finance background, it'd be quite interesting to see, you know, 10, 15 years from now, how it may look?
Yeah, so I guess all my finance background would teach me would be to say that I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know. But what I am very clear on is that there'll be paddle delivered in all sorts of different ways and at all sorts of different price points, and that will be really healthy. So, you know, sometimes I put on my tin hat and observe the indoor versus outdoor debate.
It rages in the UK.
Yeah, which is like surprisingly polarizing, and I guess it's nuanced, right? Because actually, you could describe us as outdoor. In fact, we are outdoor. From a planning perspective, we're outdoor, right? We're trying to weatherproof all of our sites.
Yeah.
Now, it's still not perfect playing conditions, right? The fact is, wind can get under canopies, and there can be a bit of moisture in the air. But I think if you look at the peculiarities of the UK real estate landscape, if we're going to have any hope of delivering paddle at an inclusive price, I think you have to accept that there's the full spectrum from perfect indoor conditions via canopied outdoor all the way to fully outdoor, right?
Absolutely, and I think that's it, and I think they can all coexist. And as you say, they can all offer very different things, whether it be big parks programs offering paddle relatively affordable, all the way up to your big indoor venues with plunge pools and everything else in between, right?
Right.
So
yeah, exactly. And we're very clear on what works for us. And I think particularly given our emphasis on staff, really that's the route for us, right? Because fully outdoor, it rains in the UK, and you're not going to have full-time coaches on the payroll that you're paying to stand around in the rain.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then fully indoor, we wouldn't be able to find a way to just support that extra staff cost in addition to the premises cost. So
the rents and rates and everything.
Yeah, so it's almost by default, this is the route for us. Obviously, everything can change, right? Who knows? There could be changes in pricing. You could have suddenly loads of new warehouses built. Who knows what the future holds? But as things stand, that feels like the right approach for us.
That's brilliant. It's really, really good to hear. So you've mentioned 2 new sites that are coming. Overall, what's your plan? Are you going to hope to build 5 more next year, or is it just sort of, as you mentioned, you don't know what the future holds, right? None of us do, and it's very fluid.
Yeah,
It's a very fluid sport. I always reference that. 6 months, the whole landscape can change. So yeah, it'd be interesting to know from your point of view where you want to be in the next 12 to 18 months.
Yeah, so we will be 5 by hopefully the end of June. We're in the process of raising funding to get to 8, and we think beyond 8 we're self-funding, so we won't need to raise any more funding. So we then have visibility over a pipeline that gets us to 16. Obviously, towards the end of that pipeline, I would not make any commitments. Not even plus or minus 18 months, frankly, because it's just that's the nature of it. But yeah, we're really, really excited at the sites that we've recently managed to confirm.
I suppose there's a long period, right? We've touched on it a couple of times, but there's a long period between confirming a site to opening a site, right? What's your longest that you've been involved with? Because obviously I've seen many a site up and down the UK which is like, oh yeah, we're going to open tomorrow. They haven't gone in for planning, and then it can take. So it'd be quite interesting for some readers. We're not reading. Listeners and viewers here to say, I don't know.
I think the common misconception is that people think like the planning process takes 3 months. Yeah, that's when you submit the application.
Best case scenario.
Yeah, but it's all the work that happens before you submit, and even after doing all that work before you submit, you then might get a response, but it's not quite the response you were looking for. You then got to do a whole load more work, right? So, I would say, we've definitely gone beyond the 2-year mark on a couple of projects already, right? And I think, that's the reality of our model. We think we end up with wonderful premises, at an effective price point that allows us to then price the product effectively, but it's time consuming and quite frustrating, and involves a bit of like charm and luck and skill to get it over the line, and that's just the nature of planning.
Absolutely, but the sport's not going anywhere, right? I sometimes feel like everyone is in such a rush to open sites up as quickly as possible without maybe thinking of everything that you've touched on. And as I say, I'm first time meeting you today, which is kind of rare in UK paddle. I feel like I know a lot of people, but it's been really, really refreshing to hear the approach that you've got at Smash Padel and where you're heading. So thank you so much for your time today. We have to get on court next time, 100%.
Are you sure?
And we are definitely putting this in. We were looking for what can we do as a bit of a challenge. I like this idea. all of the guests taking part in a big event.
Podcast guest in an averagely priced car.
There you go.
I think that's what you're looking for, but paddle equivalent.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been really, really fun, really, really interesting, and yeah, it's great to be here.
Thanks so much, Rupert.
Thank you for joining us on the TPD Podcast. We hope you enjoyed. If you don't already know, the Padel Directory is the home of all things paddle in the UK. Whether you're an industry leader or a first-time player, there's something for you on the platform.
Please join us for the next episode and check out paddledirectory.co.uk today.